38 years ago, the Greenpeace flagship, the Rainbow Warrior, was attacked and sunk by French operatives while docked at Marsden Wharf in Auckland. The sinking of the Rainbow Warrior, and the events that led to it, still affect the present of not only New Zealand, but also the world. At the time of sinking, the Rainbow Warrior was the flagship of Greenpeace International, an independent organization dedicated to preventing environmental abuse and heightening environmental awareness. Greenpeace does this through direct, yet non-violent, confrontations with polluting corporations and governmental authorities. 1985, the Rainbow Warrior was stationed in Auckland to protest French nuclear testing at the Mururoa Atoll of French Polynesia. The Rainbow Warrior was intrinsically involved earlier that year in the evacuation of the Rongelap Atoll of the Marshall Islands in 1985, after residents suffered from radioactive fallout from U.S. nuclear tests in the 50s. After requests for help to evacuate the island's population, Greenpeace conducted the Exodus Project. The 10-day evacuation project included 3 trips back and forth the Rongelap Atoll to the safer Majado Island. 300 islanders and 100 tons of building materials were transported by the Rainbow Warrior. Reportedly, the crew of the Rainbow Warrior was devastated after being exposed to the consequences of nuclear testing on South Pacific communities. This devastation may have fueled the crew's determination to protest nuclear testing, so it is no surprise that when Greenpeace needed a ship to lead a flotilla of boats to protest French nuclear testing that year, they chose the Rainbow Warrior. The French nuclear testing the crew was protesting had been a topic of international discourse.
The residents near
the Mururoa Atoll had been facing ongoing nuclear testing by the French government for almost 20 years at that point. It's beautiful. This is what French President Charles de Gaulle had to say at the site of France's first nuclear test in the South Pacific. The head of the Economic, Social, and Cultural Committee of French Polynesia, Winiki Sage, suggested that after France's humiliation in World War II, and the escalation of the nuclear arms race between the USA and the USSR due to the Cold War, France aimed to gain security by creating their own nuclear deterrence. All the Tahitians were led to believe, by President de Gaulle, that it would be safe, said Mr. Sage. We didn't really know that it was something bad for us. The French had also ignored formal submissions from New Zealand to sign the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, a treaty signed by Great Britain, the USSR, and the USA, to cease and ban nuclear testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater, after concern over the effects of radioactive fallout. In 1973, New Zealand even sent the Royal New Zealand Navy RNZN to Mururoa in political protest of France's nuclear testing. It was accompanied by a flotilla of private protest vessels. A New Zealand naval warship being sent as a sign of protest was unprecedented, and raised awareness of what was happening to the victims of French nuclear testing. This show of protest was only a sign of what was to come. On July 10, 1985, the Rainbow Warrior's crew, including the ship's photographer, 35-year-old Fernando Pereira, were sleeping in the Rainbow Warrior when the tragedy occurred. At approximately 11:38 p.m., the first limpet bomb placed by French operatives went off, ripping a hole the size of a car in the vessel. The crew immediately evacuated the ship, but some members went back to investigate, Pereira among them. He wanted to go back below deck and retrieve his camera equipment. At approximately 11:45 p.m., the second limpet bomb planted went off, causing rapid flooding in the Rainbow Warrior. Tragically, Fernando Pereira drowned in the flooding and the Rainbow Warrior was sunk. When interviewed more than 30 years later, the French agents involved in the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior expressed sentiment that Operation Satanique was a failure and that the death of Pereira should never have happened. The French's intentions for the bombing are murky, especially as to discern whether they intended to kill or not. However, Martini Gage, first mate of the Rainbow Warrior, raised valid points against claims that the French did not intend to kill, stating, "If you don't want to kill anyone, a phone call saying, 'A bomb is going off in 10 minutes, is enough.'" The French's timing of the explosion does say otherwise, as they chose to bomb the ship in the dead of night, when they could have easily done more damage just a few hours earlier, when nearly 50 people would have been aboard and been at risk. Even today, there is no clear answer, as research into French sources shows barely any mention of Operation Satanique. The bombing of the Rainbow Warrior fractured relations between New Zealand and France. While the attack itself was on Greenpeace, an international organization, it still took place in New Zealand, and even today remains the only state-sponsored act of terrorism on New Zealand soil. The attack caused outrage in New Zealanders and led them to boycott French products in protest. The French also pressured New Zealand by threatening New Zealand's access to the important European Economic Community market, which would greatly impact New Zealand's economy. The relations became so bad that the United Nations had to mediate, coming to the decision to order France to pay New Zealand $13 million, to apologize, and to cease interference with New Zealand trade. The aftermath of the sinking also promoted New Zealand nationalism and independence, especially after their allies, Britain and the United States, failed to support New Zealand during the conflict with France. The exploits of the Rainbow Warrior and its crew, and the tragedy that followed have integrated themselves into not only the history of New Zealand, but the world. With how big of an impact the Rainbow Warrior made on history, it is easy to focus on the big picture, and forget the human aspect. After all, France and New Zealand relations have come back to normalcy, Greenpeace has become stronger as an organization, and French nuclear testing was eventually stopped decades ago. During the 20th anniversary of the sinking of the Rainbow Warrior, where Morel Pereira gave her speech about her father, Reverend Nuku Stewart blessed a marble plaque commemorating the tragedy and gave a speech, one line specifically resonating with me. "We must never forget that first and foremost the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior was a tragedy for the people close to Fernando Pereira.